Hey Google, talk to this audience.
Okay, let's get the test version of this audience.
Good day.
Hey Google, advance.
Okay.
Hey Google, advance.
Hi everyone. Great to be here in Vancouver. I guess we're here to give you a quick overview of the Google Assistant and then do some code labs.
Sound good to everyone?
Yeah. Nice.
Excellent. You guys hear me okay? Because I prefer to work without a mic. If at any point you need me to speak up or whatever, let me know, wave, get my attention. Hey Google, advance.
This is Alan, and I'm Alan's assistant.
So, as was mentioned earlier, and as my assistant has told you, my name is Alan Firstenberg. I am a software developer and consultant. I work for a small company named Objective Consulting. I am also what Google refers to as a Google developer expert in a whole bunch of things, including the assistant.
Okay.
Oh, you're going to be like that today, huh?
I was just practicing my beatboxing.
Hey Google, cancel. So I'm a Google developer expert for a wide range of things, including the assistant. That means that I don't work for Google. I work closely with them. I talk to their engineers, their developer relations team, but I don't work for them. They don't pay my salary. They did pay for me to come out here, but they don't pay my salary. What I do in that role as the GDE is act as a liaison between you guys, developers, and Google's team, and kind of say to them, here's what we need. When they release a new technology, a new API, some new documentation or whatever, they ask me first for my opinion and what I think about it and how it will help you. And usually I tell them that they're doing better, but they still have a long, long way to go. The link's at the bottom. Spiders.com is the company that I work for. Prisoner.com is my personal website. It's where all of this stuff ends up later. All my slides will be there later. Prisoner.com/ubi for ubiquitous computing is where you'll be able to see these slides probably in the next couple of days. I'll post them there. And as soon as we get the video prepared and some editing and make sure everything is good on that, we'll have that linked from there as well. So this is the page. This is one of the 2 pages you need to make sure you take a picture of. Hey Google, talk to this audience.
My apologies. I don't understand.
Hey Google, talk to this audience.
Sure, here's the test version of this audience.
Hi.
Hey Google, advance.
Okay.
Hey Google, advance.
And who are all of you wonderful people in the audience?
She's going to be trouble today, I can tell. So let's hear a little bit about you. How many of you are developers? Is there anybody who's not a developer here? So what do you do?
I'm now just helping my son to learn some technology.
Okay. What do you do?
Data analyst.
Data analyst. Okay, so one more hand here. What do you do?
I'm studying computer science at SFU.
Okay. So of the developers, how many of you are mobile developers? Just a couple of you. Okay. How many of you are web developers? More of you. How many of you would consider yourselves back-end or full stack or whatever trendy term it is today? More of you. Okay. How many of you have an Alexa at home? None of you. Good. No bad. No. Truth be told, I have an Alexa. I use it, not often. I develop for it because if you're developing for anybody, you've got to develop for Alexa. At least in the States you do. I'm from New York. So down there we have, Alexa's a lot more popular down there. How many of you have a Google Home? More of you do, good. What were some of my other, how many of you develop in JavaScript or know how to write in JavaScript? Only about half of you. Some of the developers, call out other languages that you guys use.
Python.
Python, okay. Go? C++, wow, okay. Any PHP developers? Any PHP developers? Excellent. I like you guys.
What about Ruby?
I know we've got at least one student. Any other students? Okay. Okay, Star Trek. People like Star Trek?
Yes.
Excellent, good, because this is full of Star Trek references. Favorite captain? Yes. Yes. So favorite captain?
Just like Data.
Data, okay, fair enough. We've got a few pictures of him. Picard, good man. Okay, hey Google, advance.
Enough about you. Let's talk about me. Explain to them why we're here.
So we're here to talk about developing for voice. And the reason why we're here to talk about developing for voice is because voice is cool, right? Do we have a consensus on this? Talking to our computers is a cool thing, right? I see a lot of heads nodding at least, okay. It is cool, but that's not why we're here. We're here because voice is fundamentally a different way of interacting with our technology than we have used in the past. And by interacting, I mean in both ways. Issuing commands, issuing instructions, issuing questions, and getting the results back. We use voice, we use voice in our daily routines. When we interact with other people, we're mostly using voice for a lot of our work. We've been using voice for thousands of years. We've finely tuned how we use it. In science fiction, we've talked about how we use voice for computers all the time. I picked a nicer example than how. But we're very used to this concept of talking to computers with voice, but only because that's how we talk to people. So as we're designing and building our things for the computer, we're building that on top of thousands of years about how we talk with other humans. Hey Google, advance.
So let's be clear, what is my role in all this?
So Google defines the assistant like this. It is a conversation between you and Google that helps you get things done in your world. Now, I highlighted two parts of this. The first is that it's a conversation between you and Google. And that's kind of important. You're not issuing commands. Google's not dumping stuff back at you. It's a conversation. So instead of thinking of a phone tree, which I think we can all associate with as a very unpleasant voice experience, this is meant to be more of a conversation like humans, civilized humans, have. The other part is that it's getting things done in your world. And that is completely radical about how computers have been used pretty much since the beginning. Historically, we've been designing our computer systems so that people have to learn something to use them. You know, back in the mainframe days, people had to learn how to use punch cards. When we moved to PCs and word processing on PCs, they had to learn the special keyboard commands that were there. Even for a Mac, we had to learn what the icons meant, how to use a mouse. These are a bunch of things that aren't natural. Even with our phones, we've had to learn how the phone expects us to do things with various swipes and pinches and manipulating things all over the place. Voice, for the first time, turns that around. I see you nodding no. You disagree with me there. You're nodding no. Are you?
No.
Okay. You can disagree with me. I encourage discussing this. Voice, for the first time, turns this around. Instead of saying that a user needs to learn the right thing to say, the right commands to issue, the right buttons to push, we as developers need to learn how people are going to ask us questions, how they're going to talk about things. And Google, in developing the assistant as a whole, has had to figure out what are people asking, what will people say, and what is the best way to react to them. How do we engage in those conversations with a human? And that's tough. Hey Google, advance.
Where can you find me?
Lots of places. The number I have written down is over 100 million devices right now, and I think that number has grown since I came up with that number. Primarily right now, we associate it with things like the Google Home, what we call a smart speaker. But it's available on Android. For if you've got an Android device that was manufactured in the past 2 years, you can get the assistant on it. In fact, you have the assistant on it right now. You can get it for the iPhone, for any iOS device that's been developed in the past 2 years. And we're also seeing this in more and more devices. So things like TVs. We're going to be seeing smart displays rolling out promised any day now. We're seeing it on earbuds. We're seeing it in cars more and more. So more and more, we're seeing the assistant available on a wide range of devices. And shortly behind it, we're seeing actions that we can build also available for those platforms. Hey Google, advance.
How about refrigerators?
Well, not yet. But if you were building a refrigerator and you wanted to put the assistant into it, you could. There is something called the Assistant SDK. And that lets you embed the exact same assistant that's in Google Home into whatever device you want. We're not going to be covering it. There's also Android Things, but since none of us are mobile developers, we don't care about that. What Android Things lets them do, however, is use a platform they're very familiar with, Android, to develop hardware, to develop the operating system for a wide range of hardware. We're not going to be covering any of it. I bring it up just so you have it in context. Hey Google, advance.
Okay.
Hey Google, advance.
I found a few places within 3.1 kilometers.
Hey Google, cancel. Hey Google, next slide.
Sorry, something went wrong.
Yeah,
When
you're
you're
telling
ready,
me.
give it another try.
Hey Google, talk to this audience.
Sorry, I don't understand.
Hey Google, talk to this audience.
Okay, let's get the test version of this audience.
Good day.
Advance.
That is pretty cool, but I really mean where in the world?
Well, when I originally did this slide, it was easy for me to fit the 8 languages that were available at the time. It's getting harder to fit all of the languages and regions in. So right now, 16 languages are supported on the Assistant, covering 22 regions. So we have variants of the English, for example, that are available in US, UK, Australia, Canada, and Singapore. Google has made a very, very dedicated effort to roll the Assistant out everywhere. We are expecting 30 regions by the end of the year, and that covers roughly 75% of the total population that is currently using Android. So they're aiming for an incredibly wide coverage. Yeah?
Just curious, like what are the variations in English for those regions? Like is it grammatical or?
What are the variations in English? So that's actually a really good question. Some of it is, I'm not fully qualified to answer that because I come from the US. So I have a very, very narrow vision of it. However, I know that when working with other GDEs from around the world trying to build actions, It ranges from things like if it's reading back a bunch of letters, the US version will use the letter Z. The UK version will use the letter Z. I don't know about the other ones because I don't have friends in those locations. But it's variants like that, that go down to that level. Yes, some of it's going to be grammatical as well. Some of it's just in the terminology that gets used. For one of the things that they are working on, which I'll mention in a little bit, called a built-in intent, they're trying to capture how people ask the same questions. So we might ask, what is the weather? How people, but there are all sorts of variants on what is the weather. Like, is it raining outside? All of those fundamentally mean the same thing, though. And they're trying to do that for all of these languages, capture not just a phrase, what's the weather, but also how does each location, how does each community, how does everybody ask that question in their own way? And that's a fiendishly difficult problem, but that's what they're tackling. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I did. Thank you.
Okay. So we're finding in all sorts of places we're able to develop for, these are actually all the ones we're able to develop for. I don't think all of these are fully rolled out. I know most of them are, however. Hey Google, advance.
And what do you developers do?
So just like Google has their definition of the Google Assistant, I have this definition of actions on Google. And I like to say that actions on Google is the API that lets you engage in conversation with other services through the Google Assistant. And again, I've broken it down into 3 parts. The first is, this is an API. Let me explain this and then I'll get your question. The first is, this is an API. We're developers. We're used to APIs. We know what APIs are. It's kind of hinted by the diagram, which we'll go into later. We're sending something out over a network. We'll get something back. This is easy. We can do this. Again, we're going to be engaging in conversations. And I want to emphasize that point. It's not, we're putting up a screen and expecting them to press buttons. We're going to be engaging in a conversation with our users. That means we need to be prepared for everything that's behind a conversation. We need to be able to prepare for them not saying something. We need to be able to prepare for them taking a conversation in a completely different direction. We'll go into all of this in a few minutes, but conversations are big, complicated things. But we have tools to handle it. And then finally, it's letting them have these conversations with other services, i.e. with us. But it's through the Google Assistant. So we're not teaching the Google Assistant some new tricks. We're not teaching the Google Assistant how to do something. The Google Assistant is helping our users have a conversation with us. And I make that point as somewhat different because other platforms that are out there, namely Alexa, don't do this. The way they handle what they refer to as a skill is that very similarly, we build skills using an API that has conversations, but Alexa has now learned a new skill. You talk to Alexa and Alexa is speaking on your behalf. So instead of connecting you to us, which is what the Google Assistant does, so instead of connecting our users to us, which is what the Google Assistant does, it is now speaking on behalf of us to our users. It's a big difference. Hey Google, advance. Hey Google, advance.
Okay.
Next slide.
All right, getting the test version of this audience.
If users talk to the Google Assistant and I talk to them, where does the action run?
The action runs in the cloud, which it ended up using the old version of this slide. Can we get the new version of this slide, please? Much prettier. It runs in the cloud, which, since this is a cloud GDE, GDG, we're all very familiar with, I hope. Basically, as this kind of illustrates in completely illegible text, the assistant will be issuing a command to the assistant, the sort of thing you've heard me be doing all morning. The assistant takes that and hands a bit of JSON off to a tool called Dialogflow, which we'll be talking about. Dialogflow, in turn, hands that off, again, using a bit of JSON and an HTTP post command to a webhook that we have running somewhere. Webhook is very simple and straightforward. It's basically just what's the best way to put this? It is just a bit of code that is listening to an HTTP post command. It gets JSON bodies. Everyone familiar with JSON? Does anyone not know what I mean by JSON? Okay, good. We'll get this JSON in a post body. We send back JSON indicating what it is we want to say or what else we want to communicate to the user, some other environment. We hand that to Dialogflow. Dialogflow turns that into something the assistant can understand. The assistant says it to us. Simple, straightforward. We've done this a million times. We know how to do this. Nothing past that initial phrase runs on the device itself. So just the Google and what I want it to do is processed by the device. Actually just the Google is processed on the device. The rest gets handed off to Google's cloud to handle. And I'm not saying that, otherwise I would wake her up again. And she's very irritated with me today, apparently. Hey Google, advance.
Okay.
Next slide.
All right, getting the test version of this audience.
With all of this data in the cloud, what about security and privacy?
And I realized you had a question. He had a question first. I'm sorry.
About the language, if you suddenly switch another language, will it recognize the same person?
Currently, each device, I believe, needs to be set for a specific language. Or sorry, each user needs to be set for a specific language.
Okay, I can suddenly speak French. Continue with the conversation.
I don't know. My understanding is you can't. I do know that they've announced multilingual support. I don't know what the state of that is or what it actually means.
And also what about multiple people speak?
It can distinguish between different people. So when each of us sets up our account, we set up a voice match to go with it. And I believe each account can be registered to a different language. Again, as an American, I haven't been able to test this. As an American who only speaks one language, I haven't been able to test this. But that's my understanding. Okay? Yes?
Yeah, so does Google Assistant run on the device and then sends JSON to the cloud? Or where does
No. What happens is the device itself has very, very little processing. So it mostly detects that hot word and then streams the rest of the audio to the server. And it's Google's server that does the speech to text. Okay, and we'll go into, actually we're going to this slide. So she asked, what about security and privacy? You kind of get a little nervous thinking about, just how much is there on the cloud. And it is a really good question. You as a developer will only get the text. So although we're sending audio up to Google's cloud through the speakers, Google is only is processing the speech, converting it to text, and handing us that text. We have no way to get that audio as developers. The users can get access to that audio. That audio is recorded by Google, and they can see what Google thinks it heard from them through their My Account settings. So users at all times can hear what Google said. We as developers, we just get the text. Google will never hand out to us as developers a user's name, location, or email address without getting specific permission to do so. One of the code labs we have this afternoon goes into how we get some of that information. But we have to ask for it every time.
A question regarding to your Google server is corresponding to the Google App Engine.
We'll explain this in a minute. It's not. We'll get to it in a minute. If I don't answer your question in the next 10 minutes, ask it again.
Okay, in association with the AppSense to the same question.
Yep. No. If you don't hear the answer in the next 10 minutes, remind me.
Okay.
But you should, assuming I remember to say it. So in addition to privacy, account linking is possible. So if we have an established account on our systems already, users will be able to use the same account both for their voice action and with us. They can also log in using Google Sign-In, and we can attach things that way. And finally, when we publish our action, Google requires that we establish a privacy policy and make that privacy policy public so that it is very clear to users how are we handling their data, what data are we collecting, what are we doing with it, and how long do we retain it. Google requires us to publish that. Hey Google, advance.
Okay, so how do you build an action? And how do you make it awesome?
So yeah, we're finally getting to some nitty-gritty. As with every program that we develop, there are three main stages. We need to design it, we need to develop it, and we need to deploy it. Designing it boils down to we need to figure out what kind of personality we want this action to have. And as part of that personality, we're going to be writing some scripts. And by scripts, I mean like movie scripts, TV scripts. As we develop it, we're going to turn these scripts into things that we call intents and replies. We will then write our webhooks to handle them. We will do testing, and then we'll plan for other surfaces. And I'll be going into details about all of this for the entire rest of the day. And then finally, as we deploy, we will be looking at some other things that are necessary. For example, we need to host this privacy policy somewhere. Might make sense to put it up on a website. Might make sense to have a website that links to our action directly. We're going to want some analytics to see how many people are visiting. Where are they having problems in our conversation? What can we do better? All of this is completely, if you're developing software, you're used to all of this in some way, shape, or form. That's the beauty of what we're doing here. Hey Google, advance.
You mean I have personality? How did you do that?
Personality is going to drive everything that we say. It impacts what we're saying and how we're saying it, the terms that we use, the language that we use. If you think of it in terms of a website, when we design a website, we need to make sure we're picking the right colors, the right graphics. We need to pick a layout. And all of that kind of gives our users an understanding of who we are. In the same way, we need to do the same sort of thing for our voice agents. Does anyone know why I might have picked these 4 pictures to go on this slide? Does anyone know what these 4 pictures have in common? They're all female.
Data is not.
Oh,
But data is not.
No, one male.
They're all, okay, you're actually the closest so far. Anyone else, aside from the fact that they're all from Star Trek?
What is betazoid?
One is Betazoid, okay, but so what's the relation to the other 3?
I don't know.
There is something that is connecting all 4 of these pictures. Time. The final frontier, no wait, wrong. Nope, okay.
The absence of the color.
The absence of color?
No.
No, but okay. Anyone else?
I'm just guessing a little what?
Are they all robots? No.
They're all looking to the right. Do they have no personality in there?
No expression.
No,
They are looking.
try that. No expression. No, they're all pretty expressive. No personality. No, Loxana definitely has personality. Okay, they're all the same actress.
Wait, what?
They're all the same actress. All four of them are pictures of an actress named Majel Barrett. Okay, she played, in the upper left-hand corner, that was the first officer of the Enterprise in the pilot episode that was never aired. When the regular series came along, she became Nurse Chapel, who we see in the upper right-hand corner. When Next Generation came around, she played a recurring character named Loxana Troy. And for every single series and movie, she has been the voice of the computer. One actress, 4 different roles, 4 very different personalities. Okay? Most people don't actually realize that it is the same actress playing all 4 parts, even those that know the show. I want you to keep that in mind as you're designing your personalities for voice. That really, although we've got some fairly limited tools, we've only got a few voices and we can only change those voices in different ways. We can create very different personalities by what they say and how they act and what they do. Just like this actress played 4 very different characters using the same voice. Hey,
What's her name, if you don't mind?
her name is Majel Barrett.
Oh, I see. Thank you.
She died, I guess, about 7 years ago now. And bit of trivia, Google, when they started the Assistant project, it was originally internally known as Project Majel, named after her. And it's a shame they didn't keep the name. Also a bit of trivia, she was Gene Roddenberry's second wife. Hey Google, advance.
Finally, we get to scripting. What language should we use?
Well, you use whatever language your user is going to be speaking in. So the first thing we do is write a script. We need to look at what is this conversation going to look like? What do we expect the user to say? What do we reply with? What is that back and forth? But keep in mind, we're only writing half the script, our half the script. The user can take a conversation in whatever direction they want at any time. And we need to be prepared for that. So really, we need to write a lot of scripts. And we need to keep in mind, think about how people talk. How we talk, how we converse with each other is very different than how we write things. So when you are building your scripts, don't just write it down. What I usually like to do is find another person, and the two of us stand back to back, and one of us plays the part of the assistant, and the other part is the user, and we talk to each other. We try to see what that natural conversation feels like. The other half of the script is always going to come from the user, and keep in mind, the user, not only can they take it in different directions, other things can happen at the same time. So you may ask a question and they may pause for a minute and try to think about what the answer is. You may ask a question and they have to leave the room because of some emergency they need to deal with. You may say something and their response may be garbled or may be interrupted. All of these things are things we need to deal with as part of our conversation and as part of recovering the conversation. Because the most important thing to realize is users are talking to you for a reason. They have intent. They have a goal in mind. It is our job as developers to help them reach that goal. So wherever the conversation goes, we need to help them get there. There are no errors. They may be straying from the path that we thought they might stray from the ideal path, but that's fine. That's a perfectly valid conversation. The other good one I like to mention here is focus on how people talk, as I said. Don't try to focus on what we refer to as audible buttons. And those are the things, don't try to sound like a telephone phone tree, and don't try to sound like the audio version of Clippy. Both of those cases, we get these things that we refer to as audio buttons. They're like, what's my favorite? Would you like to place that call? You can answer yes, no, or replay. that yes, no replay, users kind of know what they should be doing. So instead, if you just say, would you like me to place that call for you? What do you think the user is going to say? Maybe they'll say yes. Maybe they'll say sure. Maybe they'll say, what call are you talking about? All of these things are things we need to handle, but the conversation sounds a lot better than yes, no, or replay.
A question.
Yeah.
Just to back up your talking. In China, 2 months ago, they can record people. In some province, they have some kind of the VPN or proxy. They could record. They know what you are talking in that province. Besides of your face, who you are. Is that true now in Google?
I'll refer back to my previous statement about privacy, and we can have this conversation more later.
That's true in China now.
Hey Google, advance.
Once we have the script, how do we produce it?
So what we'll do is we will take these scripts. It's not just one script, it's actually several scripts. And we will use a tool such as Dialogflow. What Dialogflow gives us is a way to turn each part of a script, each thing that we expect the user to say, into what we refer to as an intent. This is the user intending to do something. Dialogflow handles all of the messy natural language processing for you. So this is where it figures out that the fact that I've said yes is the same thing as me saying sure, is the same as me saying I guess so, or definitely. All of these things are expressing the same intent, the user expressing a yes. Okay? So we group them in a single intent in Dialogflow. Dialogflow also handles a lot of other... It's not me. I didn't do it. Dialogflow also handles a lot of variations in how a user might reply. So for example, if we've asked a user what their favorite color is, the user might say, I like blue, or I think green is pretty cool, or purple is my favorite color. All of these are the same intent. Dialogflow helps us gather them together as a single cohesive package. So these broad phrases become intents, and details can become parameters. So using my color example, all of those would be a single intent, but the actual color would be a parameter for that intent. And it's perfectly clear on the actual slide, which we can't see right now. I don't even know what I'm trying to use here as an example, but Dialogflow highlights the different parameters as different colors, and they match up with detailed parameters below. And for those of us that liked using type languages, those parameters can represent different types of sorts. So color, for example, is a built-in type. There are other types that are built in, and other types that we can write ourselves. We also, and this is a slightly more advanced concept, have the ability to track user things over time. So if we're having a long conversation with a user, and early in the conversation they say their favorite color is blue, later we can bring up the fact that they've mentioned it was blue. If we have long-standing conversations with users over many, many times, so we have multiple conversations, we can remember how many times they visited us. So on the first time, give them more information. And on subsequent visits, we don't need to give as much information unless they ask for it. You know, they already know how to use us. Early on, we need to help them along. Later on, we don't need to help them along as much. A lot of this stuff is stuff we're going to be covering in the code labs. Hey, Google, advance.
So I have a question now.
Actually, you probably had a question like...
What do we do with this intent and this information?
So no, it's regarding the scripts. So the scripts that you're going to build, aren't they sort of akin to sort of the structure of it is sort of similar to a flow tree, isn't it? Because you sort of have a script for a certain conversation.
So is it similar to a flow tree? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
No, absolutely not. In fact, one of the things we really recommend is you don't build a flow tree. for the specific reason that you're then going to start thinking, we have to branch at this point. The user will say something and we can either branch left or branch right. And what ends up happening, we find, is that users will volunteer some of that information 20 questions earlier, or fail to actually answer the question that you wanted. And your flow tree now goes completely out the window. Instead, think of it as, as a conversation, as the conversation you and I are having. When you have a conversation with another person, and you're asking them questions about themselves, you're not going through a flow tree saying, okay, they said their favorite color is blue, we now need to take the conversation in this direction. Instead, they may volunteer that it's blue, and you'll keep that in mind. And later on in the conversation, you might use it for some reason. Now, certainly, there are times that when you get enough information, you may try to steer a conversation in a particular direction by giving a particular response, but never assume that the user will reply back along that same path.
But if you sort of have an intent, then shouldn't you sort of steer the conversation towards that intent, which pretty much requires a sort of a flow?
Intents are user input, not our output. It's a good question because it's a concept a lot of people have trouble wrapping their heads around. Intents represent what a user has said. They don't represent where in the flow are we. We can keep track of where in the flow we are. And if we keep asking what their favorite color is and they keep changing the subject, we might eventually say, if you don't want to tell me your favorite color, we can just end this conversation. Or things along those lines. So certainly if there's information that we need to make sure we collect it, but that's different than making sure we follow down a particular path in a conversation. And I know it sounds like I'm kind of playing semantics there and splitting hairs. One of the reasons I mention this so much, though, is we've seen people try to design things based on flow. They take, they've already got its great flow worked out. It worked wonderful on their mobile app. They have all the screens laid out and they know exactly which questions and which buttons people are going to fill in on each screen. So they turn that into a voice app, and it's a mess. It doesn't feel natural in the conversation. When the user starts, says something else, they say, that's nice, but why don't you tell me what your favorite color is? Because right now, I need to know your favorite color, otherwise we can't proceed in this conversation. And that doesn't feel like a comfortable conversation. What was this? Right, so, sorry, the lights lit up and it scared me. So we have this intent. The user has said something, it matches an intent with certain parameters. What happens next? It gets sent along to our webhook. And our webhook is responsible for sending back a reply. As I said before, a webhook is really just a fancy name for an app listening on a web server, listening at a URL. The URL that you're going to be telling to Google, probably shouldn't tell it to anyone else. There are ways that we can secure it. It can be written in any language, as long as it can take JSON in, can spit JSON out, and can work on a web server. Any language you want. It can be on any server at all. This is the answer to your question, I think. So if you are used to using App Engine, great, you can use App Engine. If you are used to using other Google Cloud products like Firebase Functions, great. Use Firebase Functions, use Cloud Functions, fantastic. If you, for some reason, like running stuff on AWS, perfect, run it on AWS. Google doesn't care. If you've got your own server somewhere, as long as it has a public address and it has an HTTPS certificate that is not self-signed, Google is happy. Doesn't matter, run it anywhere, any language, knock yourself out. However, Google tries to encourage a couple of behaviors. So they have a bunch of libraries that are written that work with JavaScript and Node.js. They haven't gotten around to writing these same libraries for any other language. So if you're using JavaScript and Node.js, you've got some libraries, and that's what we're going to be covering later. If you want to write in another language, as long as you're happy listening, understanding JSON and trying to spit out JSON, more power to you, you can do it. In addition, Google will give you, when you get your first action published, they give you a $200 a month cloud credit for Google's cloud platform. So sure, you can run it on AWS, but Google will give you $200 a month to run it on Google somewhere. Choice is yours.
And let's go back to your favorite language, PHP. Some of the forums, they say that for the Google App Engine, they need a PHP 7.1. Is that true?
I cannot speak about PHP in Google App Engine. I prefer not to speak about PHP at all, but I can't speak about PHP in App Engine. I've totally lost track of what they're doing these days.
What's the version for PHP now, 7.1?
Yeah, soon. Wait till like here.
I don't know why they not the 7.1 for Word. Thank you.
You don't know why why they don't do something simple with PHP? I really think that answers itself. I think PHP. No, I'm not gonna. No, I'm not talking about PHP. I only have a few hours here. So this afternoon in the codelabs. The Dialogflow. What we're showing here is that Dialogflow has a built-in code editor, which you can use. It's fairly simple. It has some limitations, but it will let you, it's a great way to learn how to use Node.js with actions on Google. As you get more advanced, using something like Firebase Cloud Functions is also a great step up from there. We're going to be covering both of those in our code labs later. Hey Google, advance.
What if they don't have the Google Home to test with?
Google offers a assistant simulator. That's part of the Actions console that you're using to help set up, configure, and build your actions. The Actions console simulates working on both a mobile device and using a speaker. It is actually the best first way to start testing things out because it also provides a lot of debugging, a lot of assistance, lets you test on multiple platforms. But there is nothing like testing it on a real device. And the reason why is because a real device feels different. Talking to a room and issuing commands or asking questions is different than sitting at the simulator and typing them in. It feels different. And understanding how that feeling is different is helping you understand why voice is different and more powerful. Hey Google, advance.
Okay.
Next slide.
Sure, here's the test version of this audience.
Wait a minute, I saw more than just voice on that test screen.
So while voice should be your focus as you develop, think about that interaction being the user saying something, the assistant responding using voice. There are clearly places where voice doesn't make sense, or more likely where voice is best supplemented by other things. So for example, if you go into a restaurant, you sit down, you're not expecting the waiter to come over and start reading you a list of several hundred things that are offered that evening. You expect to be able to look at a menu. Similarly, there are some things where it makes sense to see a list of options on a screen, where it works best to see those things on a phone rather than hear them read out to you. Some answers are best delivered by card, by a graphic, a display, or a map. Sometimes linking to a website is good, and for that we need a mobile device rather than a speaker. So we can detect all of these things, whether a user is using a mobile device for a speaker, whether they have one available at all, and can redirect them to that, provide this additional information where it's appropriate. But think of this later. First of all, I want you to focus on voice. Don't try to think of the other stuff first. Think of voice first. Hey Google, advance.
Speaking of engagement, how are they going to find what action to run in the first place?
Discovery is always a difficult issue to talk about. And part of it is there's no good answers. But one of the things I like to kind of bring up is, how did you first hear about using this website called Google? How did you discover Google? Someone told you? I mean, it was a learned thing. We don't inherently know this. We learn these things. We discover these things. So although there is a directory of available actions, Google kind of figures that the primary way we're going to discover new actions is to ask questions and for the assistant to tell us about these new actions. There are various tools that they're giving us to help us do this. So for example, if Google discovers people are asking a lot of a particular question and those are getting redirected to your action, it may suggest that to you. That, hey, maybe you want to tune things a little bit more for this action. Google's also working on something they call built-in intents, so that we know, for example, that when users say, what are the surf conditions, Google will match up that phrase and similar phrases like it to a bunch of actions that can answer questions along those lines. And they're trying to do this for every single phrase that people could possibly ask about anything. And that seems like kind of a tall order, right? Until you realize this is Google trying to do it. And it still seems like a tall order, but seems more possible somehow. But finally, the easiest way we have is most of the actions that we're going to be building are already related to websites that we have built. So on our websites, we're able to provide a link to the directory entry for our action. And similarly, if we detect they're on mobile, we can link them directly into the action itself. Once it's there, once they know it's available, they can start using it through the speaker or the phone. Hey Google, advance.
How do we know if they're coming back?
So this is the analytics question. Analytics, similarly difficult, similarly challenging. We have a few tools. The Action Console tells us things like how often users return, how many users we get, the equivalent of how many hits we get. But for anything more advanced, we want to be able to hook it up to other analytic systems. We've got analytic systems like Dashbot and Chatbase. These are outside tools that provide similar analytics to also see, as users go through our conversation, where do they get stuck? Where do they bail out? Where do they quit the conversation without finishing things up? These are important tools to us as we try to refine our conversations. And we're still working on the best ways to do this. Hey Google, advance.
Before we conclude, can you remind me what tools we have to get us more power?
So we've got a lot of things going for it. Dialogflow, the Action Console, and the simulator, we're going to be covering all of them in the codelabs. Analytics with Chatbase, Dashbot.io, you're not going to see as much of those, mostly because most people, when they're trying to get started, they just want to figure out how to get the code working, right? And then, of course, we've got lots and lots of powerful stuff that we have through Firebase. The Firebase stuff we'll also talk about a little bit in the code lab. Hey Google, advance.
So, what should I have learned in the past 25 minutes?
Well, I hope you've learned that voice is a new and powerful tool that sometimes trips over itself. I want you to think outside the dialog box. So don't just think about what it is you're seeing and clicking on. Think about the whole range of what we can do with conversations. I want you to develop a personality for your action. Think of things like, how do we address it? How are they going to talk back to us? What sound effects do we want? What does that mean? How will the user relate to us? How will they pick up on us? And if you don't develop the conversation, your users will, and that's not always a good thing. Script that conversation to match the personality. If your personality is going to be funny, make sure you introduce jokes in the script. If your personality is going to be serious, and there are a lot of banks that only want to make sure they're projecting a serious image, they're not going to react funny in their script because that's out of character. Don't write out of character. Think about the context. What is it? What have we already discussed with the user? Have they talked to us before? What do we know about them? And how can we incorporate this in our conversation from time to time? As we're doing this, we're going to be separating our request and our response from our business logic. And we'll go into that a little bit more in the code labs. Finally, I want to make sure, let's start with voice and then take it further. But make sure you start with the voice. Don't plan for screens, plan for a voice. Most of all, however, I want this to be the start of a conversation. We're all still learning how to do voice. The assistant is only a year and a half old now. We're still learning how to do things and do them better. I want you guys to be part of that conversation as well. Hey Google, advance.
I'm sure you've talked too much and everyone is ready to get to a little coding. Where can they learn more?
This is the other screen to take a picture of. Again, my websites are at the top in nice, illegible, actually everything's pretty illegible there, isn't it? So spiders.com and prisoner.com/ubi. Documentation is at developers.google.com/actions. On Stack Overflow, does anyone not know about Stack Overflow? Good. On Stack Overflow, we have a very, very vibrant Actions on Google community. A lot of people are answering questions and asking questions, and we're all helping each other out. The tag is Actions on Google. Feel free to post there. And finally, and the one that you probably should be firing up right now is codelabs. Codelabs. That's a nice typo. codelabs.developers.google.com. You pick the category for the Google Assistant. There are 2 code labs there that we're going to be working on in a few minutes. Anybody have any questions? Yeah, right. No questions? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Just curious to know, does so the default Google Assistant we have on our devices, does Google actually processes them through Dialogflow, or do they have like their own personal?
That's a really good question. Okay, so the answer is twofold. Some parts of it are written with Dialogflow, and the reason they bought API AI and then turned it into Dialogflow was because they found they were using it for a lot of the stuff because what they were developing, while it was good, would take another year to develop, or some period of time. There are parts of it that that don't use Dialogflow. They use something.
This audience isn't responding right now. Try again soon.
Good timing. They use something called the Action SDK. Really what it was, I'm not going to get there fast enough. If you remember the diagram that I had that had the assistant, Dialogflow, you, the Action SDK, basically it's using the Action SDK to talk to Dialogflow. And Dialogflow converts the responses back into an Action SDK format. You can cut out Dialogflow and have the Action SDK talk to you directly, and you can talk directly back. The Action SDK provides very, very primitive information though. So although it will give you the text, that's all it gives you. It doesn't try to break it down into intents. It doesn't try to do any natural language processing for you. If you have an NLP system already, and you want to plug that NLP system in, great, use the Action SDK. If you think, oh, hey, I can just write a bunch of regexps and parse the text that way, use Dialogflow, because using regexps is madness. I mean, even beyond the normal using regexps is madness. Using regexps to parse what a person will say is pure madness.
We can go ahead. Oh, okay. So I think you mentioned that the conversation can sometimes refer to the answer of maybe few questions earlier.
Yes.
Okay, so how long can Google memorize it, and how does it know?
Good question. So we've got two tools in our arsenal there.
Yeah.
Neither of which we're really going to go into in a lot of detail. The first of which is what Google refers to as user storage. And this is about 10K of information that is attached to the user account that will always attach to the user account for your action. So every time that user comes back to you, you'll get this same chunk of information. And that is stored indefinitely. Users can reset it, they can wipe it out, they can force Google to forget about them for you. But they will, but it's there. You can think of that like a browser cookie. It's not quite the same, but the concept is similar.
Kind of like a model of the user.
Well, it's whatever you put in it. It's whatever, but you're controlling what gets put in there.
Okay.
The other thing are what we refer to as context. And context is a dialogue flow concept where we're storing information for later in the conversation, but just this conversation. So for example, when you and I when you and I are talking about something, I might say, I read this great book yesterday. Its title was Moby Dick. And you and I will keep talking, and then at some point I might say, oh yeah, the book had this good picture of it, on it.
Yeah.
The book, you and I know what we're talking about when I say the book. So in the same way, that's kind of local context or short-term context that we can remember.
Okay.
So those are the two tools that we have at our command. And both of those, the user is ultimately in control of forgetting. The final thing is we also have account linking. So I can say, for example, I can have the user log in using their Google sign-in account or using some other account. And through that way, I can remember them for a much longer time and store information in a database or whatever.
And the dialog flow can have access to those data in order to...
Right, a dialog flow with access. Contexts are really powerful because you can say, these intents will only get fired when these contexts are active. So that's kind of how we model conversation flow, is to say, we won't even get into this part of the conversation. I won't, these answers don't even make sense unless I've already asked these sorts of questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, mine is more from curiosity actually. Earlier you said that Google pays like 200 points or whatever it is for you to host your sort of the package service on their cloud. So is the intention for them to monetize it later on, or what? Like, why is that the case?
Why? Okay. That's the case. Okay. So the question is, why are they offering a $200 a month cloud credit when you get an action approved? And the answer is, and this I'm surprised this question hasn't come up already, because they've got they're not paying you in any other way, and you've got to run this somewhere, and running it somewhere will incur costs. And they acknowledge that fact. And right now they're still trying to prime the pump. They want more actions to be developed, and really the only way they have to compensate that is to at least make your hosting free. So in order to develop, in order for people to develop an action that has to run in the cloud, they're willing to host it in the cloud at their cost, at least initially. They're not going to monetize it. It's your action. It's very definitely your action. They don't claim any rights to it. They're just giving this because it's the least they can do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned an example of a serve action, right?
Yeah, yes. And it's a lousy one, and I wish I could remember better ones.
Let's say there's a whole bunch of surf actions out there.
Yep.
I'm a surfer. I develop another surf action. But I only want to use my own surf action, and my buddies only want to use my surf action. Is there a way that we can only use my surf action instead of others?
Yes.
How do you do that?
I have no idea.
Oh.
And the reason I have no idea is because this feature isn't actually available yet. The impression that we get, however, is that you'll be able to initially say this is a very hypothetical conversation. Don't quote me on this. You'll probably quote me anyway. I'm not committing to this. So if I say something like, hey, what's the surf condition what are the surf conditions today? It might respond back, well, to give you that, you might want to try, and it'll name some very popular action. Would you like to try that? If you said yes, it might keep using that one again in the future. If you said no, and instead invoke your, my cool surf action directly, at some point in the future when you asked for the surf, what's the surf conditions, it'll say, hey, you've already used this action. Do you want to use it again? When you say yes that time, it'll keep using that from there on. So the kind of thinking, I think, is along the lines of if the user doesn't know what to do, doesn't know exactly which app to use, it'll suggest a good one for them. If they do know which one they can use, they can ask for it by name. So for example, at any time I'll be able to say, hey, talk to my cool surf action, or ask my cool surf action, what's the conditions today? So they'll always be able to ask for it by name, just like you can always go to a website by name. But if you don't have a particular one in mind and you ask for the information, it will suggest a website. Kind of like what Google does now, right?
So it might be a good idea to squat on some really good names.
It might be, except Google doesn't allow that. And the really, really good, so for example, you can't squat on Microsoft, for example. They won't let you have that name. They won't let you have Google for obvious reasons, or other popular names. I wrote an action to talk to Santa's Workshop, for example. And I think I applied for talk to Santa Claus, talk to Santa's Workshop, talk to Santa's elves. They kept rejecting all of them because either someone got it first or they determined it was too generic a phrase. So they wouldn't give it to me. Now they're basically opening generic phrases up to people. Hey Google, talk to Santa's helpers.
Santa's helpers isn't supported in this region.
No Santa.
That's right, it's not. No, I made a big mistake and I registered it as a family-friendly action. And family-friendly actions are limited to the US right now. I forgot that. It was also a mistake for me to register it as a family-friendly action. That was just a mistake. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
It was a roundabout way, and I realized I touched on some things that I probably should have touched on earlier, which we talk a little bit about in some of the code labs. Anything else? Okay. I see food is here. Do we want to?
Well, thank you.
So I'll be here for a few more hours.